This tutorial is to go hand in hand with your gamut exercise. So if you want to take a look at color modes and gamut, maybe go ahead and take a look at that one first before you watch this. But what we're going to talk about briefly here is the element of color profiles, and just explain to you what a color profile is more or less, and then show you presets that you can assign to it in Photoshop that may help you work with files. So to start off, color profiles, if you've already seen the other tutorial on color modes and gamut, then you know that we have different modes of color inside of Photoshop. And I told you there that, say for example, in RGB color space, which is the color space we're going to be using for all our exercises here for this class, you have different color profiles. If you think of a color profile as just kind of like an envelope that goes with your file that kind of sends a message to the application in terms of the color data that's stored into that file, that's a good way to think about it. In other words, it's just sort of something that goes hand in hand with your file that gives Photoshop some information about color. So let's say your file was acquired with a digital camera, was acquired with a flatbed scanner or a slide scanner. You may have different profiles assigned to that will help Photoshop interpret the color data that it's getting with that file. Now, many people use Photoshop to combine images that come from different places. So you might have an image that was scanned by a digital scanner. You might have one that was acquired via your own digital camera or cell phone or what have you. And now you've got all these different profiles, these different messages being sent to Photoshop. Do you want Photoshop to sort of combine those profiles into one big profile? And if you choose a color profile that's built into Photoshop with a wide color gamut, that's a pretty safe bet that the color data that was stored with your profiles, wherever they came from, is not going to be lost. And it's pretty safe to go ahead and tell Photoshop to reassign the color profile from something that's a little more limiting, say for example, something that a colored profile that came from your scanner, into something that's deeper, something that's a big ocean of color that basically can handle all of the color data of that device, plus the color profiles that come from other devices. So let's go ahead and take a look at where you can do that. We're going to go to the edit menu, go down to the bottom of this. You'll see that there are some settings here that relate to color. We're going to choose the top one, color settings. And that brings up what basically amounts to a preference dialog box called color settings. What we're doing here is we're telling Photoshop how to handle profiles as they come into Photoshop. So for example, you've got basic presets to choose from. We're just going to stick to the general purpose, just assuming you're using Photoshop to work with files from a lot of different places, but your output intentions are more or less the same for whatever you're doing in Photoshop. But if they aren't, you can go ahead and use other presets as you work in Photoshop, or even make your own under custom. But let's stick with general purpose. All right, now the first thing it's asking is, how do you want to handle RGB color space? What profile would you like to use? And since this is the most important one for what we do in class and what we do with Photoshop in general, let's go ahead and set this to the widest possible color gamut. And currently that's ProPhoto RGB. In the past it was Adobe RGB 1998. And as things have evolved, basically ProPhoto has now got the widest gamut that we can work with. So for your RGB color space, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and choose that. Now you notice as soon as I did that, it's set to custom. So basically now what I work with has been changed from what the general default values are for these particular categories. All right, now if I go to CMYK, that's going to determine how a CMYK space is handled. In other words, there's a situation where you've got a drum scanner and you've got an image from there. It may be in CMYK color space, or maybe a certain flatbed scanner that was able to do CMYK color space. How do you want the profile to be handled there? And there's a lot of confusion here. There's a lot of different choices you can make. And I can't explain to you exactly why, because I'm not sure for the technological reasons why this is. But according to my research, the best one to choose here is US web coded. This one seems to be the best in terms of handling a variety of printers and a variety of different types of paper that you're going to be outputting to. So I go with what I read is the best, and that's what I've discovered from other people have told me this. So I'm going with that. But if you hear otherwise, you're free to choose one of these others. But just so you know how to do it, this is where you change it. Now, again, these are the color modes, and these are the profiles that will be assigned to your image or your files that you open in Photoshop. And when they come into Photoshop, they're going to be converted into this. So down here, I'm going to skip, by the way, grayscale and spot color because they're just not things we're going to work with. But again, you can choose your own specific values there as you see fit. But this is really more for advanced users. Okay, now color management policies. This is where it's asking you how each file should be treated that you open in Photoshop. So again, we come back to that example. We've scanned in an image using your flatbed scanner. Do you want to preserve the profile that came with it from your scanner? Or do you want to convert it to the working RGB space that we've assigned up there? And I would say convert it to working RGB so that you can maintain that sort of really wide color gamut, while at the same time, you might have a variety of different photos coming from different places, and they'll all be fine here in this Pro Photo RGB space. At least that's the idea. Now, people, again, I'm referring to, since I don't use a lot of CMYK images myself, at least images that start off in CMYK, I really don't have a preference here. But again, I've heard from other people it's a good idea to go ahead and leave preserve embedded profiles on in this case, or basically just because if you have a very specific profile that came from a drum scanner, for example, in that situation, you may want to preserve it as opposed to going to the more generic US web coded. But again, I'm going off of, in this case, I'm going off of something that was been told to me or what I've researched. It's not something that I work with personally. So I'm giving you the best advice I can. Now, in terms of the profile mismatches, again, these are situations where you can check or uncheck based upon your own preferences. So for example, profile mismatches. This is a situation like I described where you have different files, but they're all coming into one large file inside of Photoshop. So you've got one that came from your cell phone, one that came from a drum scanner, one that came from a flatbed scanner. And now how do you want Photoshop to treat that when this occurs? So if I'm copying and pasting data from one of these files into another, do you want Photoshop to ask you when opening or ask you when pasting it? Or if there's a missing profile, if there's no profile available, do you want it to ask you then? Or do you want it to just default to what we've set up here? Okay. Now this asking can be really repetitious, I'm going to warn you. So if you're really particular about how you work with these, then you may want to check those. But again, I'm going to give you my personal advice in terms of what I like. I would say leave these off and just let it revert to these values, these options that we've chosen, because it's really, in my opinion, very time consuming. It's clicking on these little boxes that come up, and it's always asking you about these profiles. And in my experience, it's really not that big an issue. All right, that's basically how you set the settings. So I'm going to click OK, and I'll be good to go from now on. It's going to convert my profiles into the Pro Photo color profile space. So there's nothing to turn in from this exercise, but hopefully it's been useful. We'll see you on the next exercise.